Hi guys, hi, how's it going? How you doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I'm doing the next palette review in my palette roulette series, in which I use a palette that's in my collection that might also be in your collection. I utilize it for a week. I come back to you, I talk to you about my experiences with the palette, show you some looks I was able to create, do some live swatches, and then we pick another palette. And this week, I'm actually going over the Gemini and Gemini 2 palette from Melt Cosmetics, and I'm so excited about it. And I actually did determine that I was going to be using these palettes for 2 weeks. Last week, I came at you and I did like a palette bingo utilizing these palettes instead of the palette roulette. And this week, I'm bringing you my review. So, my reviews typically are kind of chatty, but I try to give you all the information that you might want in regards to the palettes. And if you have these palettes, please sound off down in the comment section. I would love to hear your thoughts as well. And with that said, for those of you new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a lover of all things high-end, colorful beauty and self-care. I also work in the beauty industry as a field leader for Ulta Beauty, so I get a lot of education in my position. I like to bring you that education here on my platform. But ultimately, I just like to talk about makeup. That's why I'm here. I'm assuming that's also why you're here, and I hope that you'll want to subscribe before you go. And yeah, let's roll right into this palette review of the Gemini palettes by Melt. Alrighty, alright. So I did elect to keep these in use for 2 weeks versus one because I just loved them so much. I was having a grand old time with them. So today we are going to be reviewing the Gemini 1 and Gemini 2 palette from Melt Cosmetics. This is the revamped Gemini palette from Melt Cosmetics, and I'm super happy to have this in my collection. I have to be honest with you, when it first came out, my memory serves correctly, the Gemini palette was the first actual palette that Melt came out with, and launching in like 2018, I do believe, and prior to that point, they had the stacks. I hadn't tried anything from Melt Cosmetics at that point. They weren't sold anywhere but on meltcosmetics.com. And I wasn't as into indie as I currently am, but man, I fell in love with the grunge girl color story going on in the Melt Gemini palette, and I wanted it so bad. And it was limited edition, and they discontinued it, and it was always that FOMO item, or that the one that got away item. So when they came back out with it, it took me maybe 2 minutes to be like, yes, I want it. And I went ahead and purchased the two to go along with it, just because the color story of the two really serves me, because it is like a color story that I can wear every single day. It is what is on my eyes today. I do have, it is just a shimmer shadow by Cleona called Caribou. And I do have that popped into this eye look because the like rust shimmer in the Gemini 2 palette, it was far too warm for the eyeshadow that I was going for today. You can kind of see it on the internal. It is this like rusty orangey red tone there, but then I have Caribou topped on top of it so that it's kind of neutralized it. I wanted a much cooler eye look than what this palette was doing for me. So I did find myself reaching into this palette a couple times actually to pull some toppers out, just to give the eye look a little bit of a dimension. And the biggest reason why is because each one of these palettes only has 2 shimmers. I don't wholeheartedly believe that both of those shimmers in the palettes speak to the whole of the palette, so we'll get into that. I'm gonna kind of do these at the same time because I feel like they are the same, just 2 different color stories. So both of these are $58 eyeshadow palettes. This one is 10 shades of grungy green and beautiful mustardy browns, and it is 8 mattes and 2 shimmers. This is what the packaging on this one looks like. I will pop a picture in here of the old packaging. I do think that this packaging is so pretty. It also pays homage to the old packaging for Gemini in the initial release of Gemini. This palette comes in at 4.9 stars on the Melt Cosmetics website with 77 reviews. Now, I'm not sure if that is the old Melt Gemini or the new Melt Gemini. I think it's the new Melt Gemini. This is the picture of the palette that shows up in those reviews. And then on the Sephora website, they actually have both the old one and the new one on the Sephora website, which shocked me, honestly. And I was just looking at it yesterday. I swear to God the old one wasn't there before, but I guess it is. 4.7 stars on Sephora with 15 reviews for this new Melt Gemini palette. I love the packaging. I love the like mustardy brown roses and the cream colored roses. And then I love also how Melt does their palettes with like that tactile piece, right? These are all raised and you can see like the like metal foiling that's happening at the edge of the roses. The back of the component just says Melt Cosmetics and it gives you their website and their address and says that it's made in the USA. There isn't a shelf life on the package, but on the outer cartridge it does say there's a 12-month shelf life on these guys. And again, this is what the inside of the palette looks like. Nice die cut mirror with some roses on there. And again, just grungy goddess kind of colors here. We have some really like putrid greens and we have some really mustardy browns. And the two shimmers are this one here and this one here. And when I was researching these palettes, I found that the old one had quite a few more like 1 or 2 star reviews, and most of them were because of this shade here, which in the old palette was super flaky, hard to manage. I didn't find that to be a problem with this palette. The second one, the Melt Gemini 2, looks like this. Again, the packaging is very similar. It's got the raised roses. It's got the metal foiling on the side. This metal foiling is copper. This metal foiling is rose colored. It's got the beautiful like rosy tones on the front. And again, the back looks like this. And then the die cut mirror with the roses on it. And then this is this one's color story. So I feel like this one is like sassy yet feminine, has some like really light tones here going into deeper roses and then some like greens, right? Some camouflage green tones, mossy green tones, and some wines. So there's only really 2 shadows on my eye look today from this palette. There's only really 2 shadows on my eye look today besides the one that I tapped over the top, and that is this one here called LX Queen and this one here called Schmood. So this is one of the shimmers in this palette, and then this one is the other shimmer in this palette. And as I said, there are 10 shades in the palette and only 2 shimmers in each one of the palettes. I feel like if you're only going to put 2 shimmers in each one of the palettes, that both of those shimmers really need to read to the other shades in the palette, and I don't feel like that is true for these palettes. However, let's walk through these palettes. Again, each one of these has 10 shades, 2 shimmers, 8 mattes, and each pan in here is 0.07 ounces of product per pan. Just to put that into perspective for you, that's about the same size pan, 0.01 ounce less of product than what goes into a full-size Natasha Denona palette pan. Hers are 0.08. These are like 0.066, 0.067, something like that. So just rounding up 0.07 ounces per pan. Made in the USA, 12-month shelf life. The Gemini launched in 2018. It was Melt's first, I believe, as far as I can recollect, their first actual palette. The rest were stacks, and it was limited edition with the grungy greens and mustard browns. The Gemini 2 launched this year in 2022. And it's got the rosy tones that are rich and sultry and mesh well with the wines and olivey mossy tones in the palette. And it's kind of like Gemini's hot-headed sister kind of palette. Both palettes were super blendable. I had zero problems with the mattes, and I would say I've got quite a bit of a melt collection right here. Not a huge melt collection, and these were easier to blend, I feel like, than some of those palettes up there. Definitely easier than the Stacks, which I think are horrible, but also way easier than the Muerte and the Vita. I think that the 420 palette right there also has a little bit of, you know, consistency issues with blendability in their shadows. These, I did not feel that horrible, inconsistent, fickle, fussy formula that you always hear about with Milk Cosmetics did not exist in these two palettes. That much I will tell you. I think that the color story in this one and this one just kind of went, this could be a perfect, like, grungy 20 pan eyeshadow palette because all of these shadows played really, really well with each other. I didn't find that there was a pan in this palette that I couldn't use with a pan in this palette and vice versa. I also love that having both, you did have a black in the mix. What I wish also was in the mix was a lighter, like a whiter eyeshadow tone. So eyeshadow shade, because what you have here are these two really light shades, but this one is, these are very pigmented eyeshadows, and this is actually a very mustardy beige, and this is actually a very pink beige. So you're going to not have that perfect brow bone or inner corner shadow if that's what you're looking for in a palette. I have a large enough collection. Most of us have a large enough collection that we have something that we can pull from. But if you are like a one shadow, let's work this out kind of person, these aren't going to be the palettes for you. I would also say that these performed really, really well with or without a primer. Today, I've got on a primer. In most of my eye looks, I have a primer because I just wear a primer with my eyes. But for purposes of this review, I always do at least one eye look without a primer to test blendability, but also test longevity. I think that these blended just as well without a primer as they did with a primer. I would say that if a primer is going to help you out at all, it's going to be from the longevity perspective, but not by much. If I am honest, I felt like both with a primer and without a primer, these eyeshadows lasted a good amount of time. I travel a lot for work. I start off at 7 a.m. I need an eyeshadow look to look decent on my face from about 6 a.m. when I put it on or 7 a.m. when I put it on to about, 8 or 9 p.m. when I finally pull into my next hotel. And these did that. They looked spot on perfection. I didn't see any kind of fading with them at all. And in the blend, I didn't see, with or without primer, I didn't see any kind of voiding or any kind of skipping or any kind of patchiness. Except for on my one eye, it's this eye over here. Like, there tends to be a blend problem up here because I am starting, I have aging skin, I have aging eyes, and it's not quite as tight as it used to be. And I don't pull my eyelids up because when I pull my eyelids up and then let it back down, like, the eye looks just silly, right? Because my eyes aren't always going to stay pulled up and pulled back the whole day. So I don't do that. I do get a little bit of patchiness, but that is my skin. That's got nothing to do with the shadows. What I found to be true is that with many, many great eyeshadows, no matter how your skin is, you are able to blend it out if you just take your time, and these were no different from shadows that allow that. But I have had trouble with Melt shadows in the past being kind enough to my aging skin to help me help them. And these ones just didn't seem to work against me like I have had Melt Cosmetics shadows do in the past. So I love Melt Cosmetics. They're one of my favorite brands, if I'm honest, but they are one of those formulas that you really can't give to a newbie and say, here you go. This isn't a good gift for a new person, but I would say that these two eyeshadow palettes I would give to like my daughter who doesn't do makeup like I do on a daily. So the shimmers in these palettes are, I think, more firm or denser, that more dense than I have seen from other melt formulations in the past. And when I say that, it's because a lot of times a melt shimmer will go on your eyes and you do need it to go over the top of a tacky base to be impactful, or you do need it to be wet to go on without falling out all over the place. I will be 100% honest. I didn't have any fallout problems with the shimmers in this palette as I have had before with shimmers in this palette. And when I say I think that they're more firm or dense, it's because they also didn't need a tacky base underneath them to be impactful. Like, this is not over a tacky base. It's just over the top of an eye primer. And I didn't need that tacky base or that glitter glue or anything like that to adhere the shadow to the eye look in the way I needed it to adhere to the eye look. They go on, they're super opaque from the get, and you don't really, I didn't see any kind of fallout. Now I'm going to tell you, you all know whether there's fallout or not. I just did not notice it coming from these two palettes. What I will also say is that these are super powdery in the pan, and sometimes that also translates to fallout all over your face or a much drier formula in eyeshadow, and that's not the case for these. Again, I didn't see a whole lot of fallout all over my face. It just doesn't equate to fallout. Another thing that I really, really love about these and why I'm glad that I waited to get Gemini in this packaging and didn't get it in the old packaging is because this packaging, you guys, is stunning. It's so pretty, and that's one thing that Melt always does so well, is their packaging is what really could draw a person in. And although I wanted the Melt Gemini, even if I did not want the Melt Gemini, this packaging would have drawn me in. I think it did with the Muerte and Vita palettes way back when. I love those palettes too, but back in the day, that packaging is what drew me in. Melt does packaging really, really well. What they also did with these shadows is, I don't know if you can see them, but each one of these pans has really beautiful rose embossing on it. Every time I went in to one of the eyeshadows in here, I tried to dip my brush in an area where the embossing wasn't, because it's just so pretty. It's just so pretty. So with that said, these are pretty fantastic palettes. I definitely think that they need to be in my collection, and I don't think that it would be horrible if you also put them in your collection. I definitely think that they're worth the money. And I was actually kind of surprised at what I know to be true for Mount Cosmetics and what these actually brought to the table as far as workability. Another thing that I wanted to mention as I was going through my notes is that the shimmers in here, if you need like a super impactful, super shiny shimmer, these are different kinds of shimmers. They're not like satin shimmers, but they're also not super impactful like Jady Glow kind of shimmers. So if you need a shimmer that is like see me from the moon, these are not going to be the appropriate shimmers for you. The other thing I want to mention is that appearances really are deceiving. When we look at these on the websites, like I can see these 4 shades here look very, very redundant, honestly. And when you also look at this and you see the greens in this palette and you partner them with the greens in this palette, I feel like we think that there's a lot of redundancy in these two as well, and there's not. Like, it's definitely 20 different shades that really build well, gradient well. They're really great eyeshadows, and they partner together really, really well, and you definitely get a different color with each shadow in this set. And even though like there looks to be a lot of, you know, redundancy in the palette, let's do some swatches and then we'll talk final thoughts, and then we'll pull another palette. Okay, scooched over so we can do some swatches. I'm going to swatch the Gemini 1 first on this hand, and then I'm going to scooch over and put Gemini 2 on this hand. So there are only 10 shades, so I'm hoping I can get all 10 on my hand. They're all really super silky smooth. I'm really sad. I'm wiping off all the embossing right now. Okay, so the first shade is this one, and it is Luna. It is a creamy mustardy tone. It's got a little bit of a peachiness to it, but it is gorgeous as a, blend out shade for almost every shadow in this palette. And then we have Gemini, which is a point of contingency in the old palette, but I'm telling you, I did not have any problems with this shadow. And it's actually one of those like coppery golds that I really, really love to wear. I'm not a gold fan for the most part, but this one was stunning. Then we have Lorelei, which is a mustard yellow. Then we have Polka Dot, which is a mustard toned brown, kind of a yellowy brown. And then we have Cupcake, which is a deep brown with kind of a cooler tone than Polka Dot. Then we have Bonnie, which is the straight up black in the palette, and this is a really, really good black. Why are we not focused? There we go. Sorry about the focusing issue. Then we have Leo, which is a deep like army green shade. Then we have Goals, which is the other shimmer in the palette, and it is a really pretty like chartreusey lime green shade. And then we have Fire OG, which is a secondary army green, but it's got a little bit more of a warmer tone to it than the other army green. I don't think that you can see a lot of difference in those two, so I'm gonna kind of swatch them bigger. Can you see? One is a little bit more yellow toned, and the other one is a little bit more brown toned, or gray toned. So you're gonna get like two different shades of army green in an eye look. These look actually very, very different. And then we have this Mochi, which is dirty chartreusey green. I think that you can see a lot of variety in that palette alone with just the two different halves of greens and browns. You're gonna have a lot of different eye looks that you can come up with in just these 10 shadows here. All right, let's do this one on this hand over here. So in this one we have Bella, which is a beautiful like peachy pink. That is the lightest shade in this palette. And then we have Ladylike, which is kind of more of a brown toned peachy pink. Then we have Sweetheart, which is kind of a dusty rose shade. Then we have Gemalas. Is that how you say that? Gemalas? I'm not sure. That's a kind of a deeper dusty rose shade. And then we have Lovesick, which is a really beautiful like brick red shade. Then we have Schmood, which is the first of the shimmers in this palette. This is in my eye look today. This is a very rusty, like really warm toned copper. It's a little bit, in my humble opinion, it's a little bit too orange to play well with the reds and the pinks in this palette. I wish this shade was a little bit more red than it is orange. And then we have this one here, which is called LX Queen. This is really, really a beautiful, like plummy brick red in the palette. And then we have Mateo, which is the second shimmer in this palette. Just a really dingy, dirty, green, mossy oliviness. So grungy and beautiful, and really pairs well with almost everything in this palette as a shimmer. And then we have Boimum, which doesn't swatch well. I will be 100% honest. But it is kind of a more brown toned olive green, very dirty and dingy. Definitely brings the grunginess into this palette, because otherwise this palette would just be straight up like rosy toned, like girly girl kind of palette. But it brings that attitude that I think this palette wants to have, because it's a partner to Gemini 1. And then we have Almond Eyes, which is a really pretty like deep sagey green. So those are those shadows. And then here, these are the two palettes together, and I think that you can see how wonderfully they can play off of each other. I don't think that there's any kind of like serious redundancy in the palette. I'm gonna turn off this one light that I've got going on. I think that you can see that there's not a whole lot of redundancy going on in the palette. There's like even the greens that are in the Gemini 2 palette play very, very well with the greens that are in the Gemini 1 palette, and also the browns that are in the Gemini 1 palette, and those pinks play very well also. I mean, straight across the board, these two palettes were meant to be together. I mean, overall, in a nutshell, I'm really happy to have these palettes in my collection, and I enjoyed them so, so much. I think that Melt could have put, you know, brought out Gemini and made it a 20-pan eyeshadow palette and made it with these palettes here, and people would have jumped all over that. Just like they did the two palette. I think it's smart that they did, you know, two palettes, two separate palettes, because you get that price point for both of those palettes, and also like it separates the grunginess of Gemini from the like redheaded stepsister of Gemini 2. I think that they are gorgeous, and I'm happy to have them in my collection. And I would say that if you're a newbie, but you've heard all the horrible things about, you know, the, like I said earlier in the video, the fickleness, the finessing that you have to do, the how it's not good for a beginner kind of mindset with the Melt formula, I really do think that you'd enjoy these two palettes. And I really do think that these are set up in a way, and their formula is perfected enough that I think a newbie to makeup could play with these palettes and not get frustrated or exhausted with trying to blend and trying to not make it muddy and trying to, like, I just think that these palettes are fantastic, and I'm super happy to have them in my collection. So I'm gonna go pick another palette. I will be right back. Okay, friends, we are gonna go with two palettes again, just because I feel like, again, like the Melt Gemini and Gemini 2, these palettes were maybe meant to go together to some extent. I have the ABH Nouveau, which I bought when it first came out, and then I also have the ABH Rose Metals, and I think that these are the two palettes that we'll be using throughout the next couple weeks. Yes, I did say couple weeks. I think it's a good idea for me when I'm doing two palettes at a time to go with 2 weeks. I do think that these two palettes will play well together. We have a little bit of cool tone, a little bit of warm tone. We have some really great shimmers. I'm excited to try and play with them. I haven't played with them yet, and they've been in my collection now for a couple weeks. I did go ahead and separate the palettes from the ones that I've used already and the ones that I haven't. I also have a spreadsheet going. So I do have a palette declutter coming up soon. I do think that we're in a place where we could very likely run out of palettes to do for Palette Roulette very soon. But with that also being said, doing these Palette Roulette videos kind of puts me in a mindset of I need to use those palettes that are in my Palette Roulette only, and I don't typically pull for other palettes. So I'm thinking of doing a different kind of like palette series next year. I've been doing this Palette Roulette series now for like 3 years. This is episode like what, 190 something. I've reviewed like over 200 palettes at this point, and while I love doing these and I feel like you guys also love watching these, there's other ways that I could utilize my palettes and get more use out of my palettes. I'm also thinking through the lens of project panning next year, what I want to do. Do I want to bring palettes in? I'm thinking about a pan that palette next year. So I have a couple in my collection that I could probably pan or should pan, but at the same time, I'm not a panning community like channel, right? I do project pans, but I'm not like heavily part of the panning community. So let me just know your thoughts. What kind of palette minded videos would you like to see next year that are quasi along these same lines, but also not? I really enjoyed doing the Natasha Denona My Dream Collection palette review that went up when that first came out, but I don't want to get into a place where I'm purchasing all the new palettes all the time to review, because I just won't do it. I don't want to burden my finances in the way that a lot of people that are always bringing in the new have to be burdening their finances. That's not what my channel is about. My channel is about using what I have. You know, yes, I haul things in, we all do, but my channel is more about utilizing what I have. So these are newer on the market. These were newer on the market-ish. There are occasions that I am able to get like newer on the market, you know, kinds of palettes into this palette roulette series. But what kind of palette focus content would you like to see next year? I would like to do something along the same lines where I'm reviewing something for you or showing you, you know, looks that I created from palettes, but not necessarily palette roulette, because I'm running out of palettes to pull into a palette roulette at this point, unless we want to like revisit palettes that we've already visited. Anyways, I'm looking to you guys for guidance. That's what I'm saying. I want to continue doing a palette focused series on my channel next year, but I just don't know what that's going to look like, and I would love to hear your thoughts. With that said, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this palette review of the Melt Gemini palettes, and if you did, please do consider giving it a thumbs up. And making a comment down below. It really does help our channels. Every little bit counts. I also hope that you liked me enough that you do want to subscribe before you go. I would love to have you and welcome you into my wonderful YouTube fam here. And yeah, I just hope that everything is going well for you guys. I hope that you and yours are safe, that you're healthy, and that you guys are having an awesome November so far. I know it just started, but we've already had snow. Have you already had snow? So crazy. Thank you guys so much for joining me today, and until next time, bye friends.